Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm Layla Taha, Executive Director of the National Flood Association, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's session, Navigating 2024 Flood Map Revisions, Insights, Impacts, and Challenges. As a brief introduction for those who may be less familiar with the National Flood Association, it is a national nonprofit trade organization that works to advance the common interests of the flood risk management community. Our membership is comprised of a diverse group of flood stakeholders representing insurance, lending, flood mapping and data, and claims, and other segments of the market with a vested interest in flood-related topics. Today's session will provide insights into FEMA's flood insurance rate map revisions that are impacting tens of thousands of property owners this year, and to learn more about how flood determinations are revised to reflect new flood zone and map information and how those updates are then communicated to property owners. Before we begin, we encourage you to enter any questions you may have during the presentation into the chat, and our presenters will address them during the Q&A portion of this session. Also, if you're a certified floodplain manager interested in earning one continuing education credit for attending today's session, please navigate to the CE credits menu item in this app and enter the word Broward, it's B-R-O-W-A-R-D. We've also entered that into the chat for your reference. And this will allow us to confirm your interest and to provide you with a certificate of attendance that you may submit to the ASFPM for credit. Also for your reference, you will find biographies for each of today's panelists in the speakers section of this app. And you will also find more information about the National Flood Association in the documents section. A recording of the session will be accessible on demand on NFA's YouTube channel, and we will send you details of this via email within the next week. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to our esteemed panel, Jennifer Hahn of ServiceLink National Flood, Barry Childress of CoreLogic, and Corey Eskelin of Exactus, who are all flood zone determination experts and leaders of NFA's Data and Mapping Committee.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to just do a quick overview of what our discussion is going to look like. Today, we're going to specifically focus on the basics of flood map revisions, the areas affected, maybe some anticipated impact. We've also got some chat about processes for updating flood zone determinations, and then impacts and challenges that are faced by all of those who deal specifically with the revisions and mapping. Barry is going to take it first here with our basics. So Barry, if you are ready to go, I think we are. Let's get it started.
So my name is Barry Childress. I'm with CoreLogic. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So today I'm just going to cover the who initiates map revisions, how often, the types of those revisions, and where they happen. Next slide, please. So with over 20,000 communities participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, it is a challenge to keep up with the flood hazard maps, keep them up to date. There are primarily three methods by which community flood hazard maps are updated, though. The first is FEMA-initiated map updates. Each year, FEMA initiates studies and restudies of flood hazards in communities across the United States for the creation as well as the revision of community flood hazard maps. The second is the community-initiated map revisions. The flood hazard maps must be, present the flood risk information that is correct and up to date, and they provide a sound basis for floodplain management and insurance rating. FEMA relies heavily on communities to provide notification of the changing of flood hazard information and to submit the technical support data needed to reflect the updated flood hazards on the NFIP maps. Now, although FEMA may request to change a map, although you may request a map to be changed or information on the map to be changed, presented on NFIP maps, FEMA generally will not revise effective map unless the changes involve modifications to the special flood hazard areas, such as the 1% annual chance or the quote unquote special 100-year floodplain and or the elevations. FEMA requests that revisions that involve other information such as changes to the roads or corporate limits, they will not typically revise the flood insurance rate maps for those. They'll just typically file that information away for future use. Now, to assist in the map revision process, FEMA has developed applications or certification forms and instructions for the communities for the revisions to the maps. The third way maps can be revised is through the Cooperating Technical Partners, or CTP initiative. This is an innovative program that's been created to foster partnerships between FEMA and participating NFIQ communities, as well as regional and state agencies that are capable that have the capability to become more active participants in the FEMA flood hazard mapping program. And communities can participate in a number of ways, which may include the development of hydrologic and hydraulic modeling and mapping, the refinement of the Zone A approximate floodplain boundaries, digital map database information sharing, and digital topographic data such as LiDAR information. FEMA is always seeking qualified partners to collaborate in maintaining up-to-date flood maps. And what I've provided there is just a digital version of today's map that went into effect for Broward County. And I have a link to a list of the Cooperating Technical Partners initiative all across the United States. Next slide, please. So how often? FEMA is required to review a community's flood maps every 5 years. If the community's map's not assessed within a 5-year window, then the level of risk could be considered unknown. So FEMA reassesses flood maps regularly because the risks, aren't static. The risks do change over time, for a variety of reasons or factors, like the changing of land use patterns, and due to development and of course climate change. Now FEMA must then decide whether or not to update or change the maps. Now, if they do this, FEMA must also tell Congress every month of any planned changes to a community's flood maps, providing details such as mapping milestones reached in the previous month, an estimated schedule of mapping activities anticipated over the next 3 months, and in their monthly notice to Congress. Now, this notice to Congress includes information about the communities that within the next 3 months will receive updated draft maps, known as preliminary maps, and revised preliminary maps. It also includes when FEMA will publish the community notices about the release of the maps and the appeal period for that process. That notice to Congress also includes the communities that will have received letters of final determination, or LDFs, about their updated maps. And it also includes whose maps are considered final effective maps. FEMA, initiates these studies and restudies in communities across the United States for the creation and the revision of the community flood hazard maps. However, because of funding constraints, FEMA can study or restudy only a limited number of communities each year. As a result, FEMA prioritizes study and restudy needs based on a cost-benefit approach, where the highest priority is given to the studies where the development is greatest and where the maps are most outdated. So what I've provided on the screen there is just a kind of a snapshot of years 1 through 3 of the risk map revision process. Next slide, please. So a physical map revision. A physical map revision is a type that it's an action whereby one or more map panels are physically revised and republished by FEMA. A physical map revision is used to change the risk zones, the floodplain, and or the floodway delineation, flood elevations, and planimetric features. To ensure that those affected by a physical map revision have the opportunity to provide input, a physical map revision has procedures that include community comment period and a 6-month compliance period to update ordinances while the maps are being printed and distributed. Because of the large number of, the large amount of flood hazard information that is incorporated into the maps and the number of people that will be affected by that information, a physical map revision can take as long as 18 months to complete. Now, FEMA does charge the requester of a physical map revision a fee for the review of the data that's submitted in support of certain types of requests, as, concerning structural measures. Physical map revisions must be requested by the chief executive officer of the community, because the community ultimately is responsible for the adoption and of the revised information into their specific ordinances and regulations. And what I have there on the screen is just a snapshot of the 2014 Broward map and the map that went into effect today for that same area. Next slide, please. So a letter of map revision. A letter of map revision is a document that officially revises a portion of the NFIP map according to the requirements and procedures outlined in Part 65 of the NFIP regulations. A letter of map revision allows FEMA to revise the flood hazard information on the NFIP map via a letter without physically revising or reprinting the entire map panel. This process is typically, it takes less time and is much more less expensive than a physical map revision. Next slide, please. So LOMRs include the revised portion of the flood hazard map affected at the affected flood profiles, the floodway data tables from the flood insurance study report. They includes them as attachments to the letter. LOMRs essentially, like physical map revisions, they're like physical map revisions in that they do change the flood risk zones, the floodplain and or the floodway delineations, the flood elevations, and once again, the planimetric features on the maps. However, because of their limited distribution, LOMRs are primarily intended for small areas of change and areas where flood hazards are typically decreasing. So I've included a snapshot of a LOMR from, I believe, 2018 in Utah, and you can see where in this particular LOMR, the special flood hazard area did decrease from the original map. Next slide, please. So FEMA, does charge, once again, the requesters of LOMRs a fee for the review of the hazard data submitted in support of that type of request, especially those concerning structural measures. And as with the physical map revision, a LOMR must be requested through the chief executive officer of the community, because once again, the community is ultimately responsible for the adoption of revised hazard information into the community's floodplain management ordinances and regulations. And next slide, please. So where does this happen? Those changes can happen all across the United States, including all the U.S. territories. Now, you can check the status of your request. Property owners or other persons who wish to follow the progress of physical map revision or letter of map revision or some other type of revision are advised to consult their community's floodplain administrator. This is the person, the local official, who keeps all the community's flood hazard maps and flood insurance report up to date, and who corresponds with FEMA at various stages through the revision process. They're often the person that is, the official is usually the city or county engineer, or could be the director of planning or zoning for the community. So I've included some links, some helpful links there for the flood map changes viewer. This is a viewer that incorporates preliminary, pending, and effective national flood hazard layers. It also incorporates preliminary changes since the last flood insurance rate map and the preliminary map comparison tool. I've also included a link to the mapping information platform, a studies tracker, links to the checking your ongoing status of your map revision, a link to the Federal Registrar, and of course, a link to the FEMA Map Information Exchange. Next slide, please. And that's all for me. I believe I've handed off to Jennifer.
Gary. So I'm going to discuss the impacts of these map revisions. We've talked about the basics, what constitutes a map revision, who can initiate map revisions, and now let's talk about the impacts to the users, the major users of the data specifically. We want to focus on three major factors: volume, insurance changes, and tracking. Determination companies all have their own processes, methods, and systems for handling revisions. We all share the challenge of processing and notifying within required SLAs. That will look different from company to contract, depending on what it looks like. But volume is one of the biggest factors. We know we're this today's date 7/31 is a very large one for us, Broward specifically. And so we can talk about the before and after with Broward here, of another example of a before and after the 2014 maps and the 2024 maps. And I believe this little snippet speaks to volume pretty well. You can see the vast majority of the properties that were in zone shaded X here are now going to be the AE zone. So that's going to impact notifications, how we manage basically the volume with this is going to be difficult. Broward has been something that we've talked about for months at this point, knowing that it was coming. This slide here is specifically shows the total map revision. So essentially the total number of properties being tracked and the number of properties that are going to be revised. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it could be an out or an in this case, but it's approximately 49% of properties in 2024 that have been affected by a revision are going to have some sort of zone change. The top 24 revisions by county here. So these are the four largest communities based on the total number of properties affected that received new PMRs this year. We can see, as I said previously, Broward has that largest chunk there. Tennessee, Marion, Indiana, Monroe, New York, Davidson County, Tennessee all have a number of out to ins, but they are much smaller than Broward in this impact specifically. This slide is going to show you the implication of map-ins. The 2024 has actually had one of the larger percentage of map-ins than we see historically. I think that Broward is probably going to play a role in that one. But you can see, while the percentages look small, the actual real number impact is quite great. One way to determine impact we can see through the NFA and in our annual surveys that we have every year. It's data is being collected relative to the volumes of the flood zone determinations produced, tracked, and reviewed over the course of the year. And the next few slides will be all of 2023. NFA member companies produce over 90% of the flood zone determinations that are performed and distributed annually. So that's a lot of tracking for insurance changes. You can see last year we identified just over 183 million determinations that are being tracked over the country by our different users and member companies. This is a process that, again, like I stated previously, the way that we track, the way that we update is going to be slightly different from company to company. But essentially, when you're tracking and pulling for new maps, you're essentially reworking an initial zone determination. And so volume weighs heavily on what that looks like as far as staffing, timeframes, and getting all the documentation out to meet our SLAs. Life of loan determinations impacted by firm revisions. So these are going to be both the PMRs and the LOMRs with the annotated firms. You can see we had a large push in the end of the 2000s, and things have kind of settled off here. That was a different type of push, or a map mod program that FEMA had. Out of the 183 million flood certificates that are being tracked by our member companies, approximately almost 3 million were revised as a result of the map revision. So between the member companies and uh, the volume, you can see how this is a big impact. And then lastly, this is going to basically talk about the experiences, the status, excuse me, apologize, life of loan determinations that experience status change. So essentially in to out or out to in. So while we focus a lot on map ins, because we know that's going to trigger the insurance requirement and many people will fall within the mandatory purchase requirement, we also see that as of last year, the change was almost even from what moved into out and out to in. That is definitely going to be a positive when someone gets that determination back. I let's see here. I think that's the end of my slides. Again, most member companies are going to have their own ways of tracking their portfolio. Each company is going to have their internal processes that handle the volume with staffing and everything. Barry or Corey, do you have anything else to add to impacts? That went kind of fast. Sorry.
So, yeah, I mean, you as you brought up, a lot of the challenges that we face and that I was going to speak to next, specifically feast or famine. If you can flip back to your first bar chart, the top 2024 revisions by company or by county. So this illustrates pretty well kind of the feast or famine challenge that is the main thing we face when we're doing processing map revisions. As determination companies, like you said, we have contractual obligations to our clients to let them know when their loans are being affected by a map revision. We have to go back through our portfolio of track determinations, determine who's being impacted, how they're being impacted, and then we have to, based on contractual obligations, which can vary from client to client, send notifications to that client to let them know what's happening with their portfolio of loans. This chart really speaks perfectly to that feast or famine. these are the top 4 revisions so far for 2024. 4 counties in 4 different states. And you can see the blue property count for those counties. The first 3, you're talking 250, 350,000 properties in the county. The impact to those properties is very, very small. You're talking 15, 20%. But then you see that, again, we jump back to Broward, Florida, which was revised today. You suddenly have, a property count way up there, way up there. And then you look at the impact, and you suddenly go from a 15, 20% property impact to almost an 80%. Across the industry, we're probably, we're talking hundreds of thousands of determinations that are going to have to be reviewed, that are going to face an update and have to involve a notification to the client to tell them something has changed with your loan. And now if you want to flip back down to the challenges slides, right there, feast or famine. We have, like Barry said, the letters of final determination, which are issued 6 months prior to a map revision. So we know 6 months before it happens that a community is getting new maps. To the fourth point here, delivery timing for new flood maps and the subsequent revalidation letters. So the revalidation letters are the letters of map revision, letters of map amendment for a community that are going to remain in effect after a revision takes place. Those are issued the day after a physical map revision goes into effect. So today we received map revisions for, I believe, 14 counties. I don't remember the exact count. Broward just being one of them. Tomorrow we'll have effective revalidation letters for some or maybe even most of the letters of map amendment and map revision that were effective yesterday prior to the maps being revised. But the back to the letters of final determination. So we know 6 months prior to the maps changing that they're going to change. FEMA does this per regulation because they have to allow those communities that time to adopt those new maps into their floodplain ordinance and begin utilizing that new data. That is a requirement for participation in the National Flood Insurance Program. You have to adopt those new maps. Failure to do so can result in suspension from the program. So if you have problems with those maps, you want to discuss that with FEMA before they go into effect. You don't want to wait until they're in effect and then have that discussion because it could jeopardize your participation in the program. So while we know 6 months in advance that they're coming, those maps aren't available for review 6 months in advance all the time. Typically, we see that the maps become available for us to review, assimilate into our internal processes to begin preparing for use of those maps 3 to 4 months prior to the actual revision. And one of the issues that we face, one of the challenges, is that there's no set time frame for release of those maps. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes we don't get those maps until a month before. Sometimes there's technical issues with the files that are released. We've entered an era of digital mapping several years ago. That was a big spike that Jennifer pointed out on her graph, where FEMA in the late 2008, 2010 area, FEMA's push to modernize the maps was essentially to move to a digital platform, move away from the paper maps. 20 plus years ago, the determination industry was pulling out a paper map and physically plotting a property location on that map. Now tools have changed vastly, but so have the challenges. Technically speaking, we're not ingesting paper maps and digitizing paper maps anymore. We're ingesting digital files created to display those maps. So any issue with those files can cause a challenge. So the other thing we see, can we go to the next slide, please? This is just a quick breakdown of, again, another way to look at the variation we see in the physical map revisions. This is a breakdown by date for the first half of the year, and then for the month of July. Essentially, we have 2 revision dates a month. Every 2 weeks, FEMA schedules the release of a physical map revision. So, say the first one of the year, January 11th, 42 communities. If I recall, I believe that was out of 5 counties. And it resulted in 343 panels being revised. Something that hasn't been covered. So a physical map revision can be just one panel in a county. It doesn't have to be every map in the county. Now, oftentimes it is, but it could just be 1 panel, 2 panels, 4 panels. It really just depends on so many different factors. What is studied, what needs to be studied, who's participating, who's dealing with that revision, who's involved in studying the area and providing the new data. But as you can see from this breakdown, it varies widely. The second revision in January was only 14 communities. I believe that was only 3 counties. And again, there was half the number of panels revised as 2 weeks prior. Then 2 weeks after that, 4 times, 5 times as many panels were revised. So feast or famine, it varies greatly from revision to revision, how much you're dealing with. On the subjective side, like Jennifer said, it's going to vary based on from company to company what your tracking portfolio looks like. What things or what areas your portfolio covers, who your clients are, what their loan profiles look like, what their lending footprint looks like across the country. The notifications present a challenge sometimes, just depending, again, kind of more to the contractual obligations and service level agreements that each company has with their clients. In general, there's no right or wrong. Again, it's all basically what you and your client agree to, what your client needs for their processes, what you're able to provide based on your processes. Industry standard for a long time has been a 60-day turnaround. You notify the client within 60 days of a change to their loan, that change has occurred, so that they can get a letter out to their borrower, notifying them either flood insurance is no longer required or that flood insurance is now required. For those that are moving into a required status, that starts a whole nother time frame. Once that letter is issued by the lender telling a borrower that they have to get flood insurance as a condition of their loan, there's a 45-day window where the borrower has 45 days to comply, or the lender has to look at forced placement as a condition. So there's timing can be very, very, very important, and getting these notifications out again becomes a challenge if you're looking at a huge revision like today's, or something more modest like one of these earlier revisions this year. The final challenge I was going to speak to is less about physical map revisions and more to the letters of map revision and letters of map amendment. Barry spoke briefly about the letters of map revision process and how those come about. Those are not regularly scheduled. They don't follow this pattern that the physical map revisions do. So they do present more of a challenge, while they are still required to be made and announced 6 months prior to going into effect. We can see those. We know they're coming for the physical map revisions, but for the small map revisions, what I call the letter of map revision annotations, where they're actually producing portions of maps. Those require a 6-month lead time before they go into effect, again, so that the communities can adopt those into their ordinance. Letters of map revision that don't involve a small map annotation or letters of map amendment don't require that lead time. They don't require an announcement. FEMA processes hundreds and hundreds of these a week. And they release those typically, they issue a batch file every Monday that includes the previous week's issuances. So those also fall into the notification timeline. They have to be updated in a timely fashion. They have to be reviewed, processed, and then notifications provided to the clients based on changes brought about by those letters. When you intersect those with physical map revisions, that's where the delivery timing for the revalidation letters becomes crucial. Like I said, a revalidation letter essentially reissues or revalidates, just like the name says, the letters of map amendment and letters of map revision that were effective prior to a physical map revision. So you have a physical map revision, you want to start processing that as soon as possible, updating determinations, getting those notifications out to your client, but you hold back review of certain determinations, certain properties that were affected by a letter of map amendment prior to the map revision, because you know tomorrow, hopefully you're going to get that revalidation letter and see whether that property status is changing or not. It used to be we would not get revalidation letters for quite a while. It could take weeks and sometimes months to get a revalidation letter after a map revision. And so the process would have to go on without those. And then we would have to rework those once the revalidation letter became available and potentially send conflicting notifications to a client. FEMA has done wondrous things with their LOMA processing in recent years, and their revalidation letter schedule is improving every week, honestly. And that's something that the Data and Mapping Committee has been working with them with for the last several years, providing feedback so that we can get that process where it needs to be. And I'm happy to say that looking at today's physical map revision, today's date, we're looking at 183 communities affected, 189, 667 panels. Of all of those counties, all of the revalidation letters for all of those counties, save one, were posted and available Monday. So ahead of time, we know what LOMAs are going to remain in effect. The only downside there is the one county that is not yet available is Broward, Florida. Again, challenges constantly. But with that, I will turn it back over to Jennifer. I think we might have some questions from the audience we can address.
Yes, I also had a few kind of comments to tack on to your challenges section there. I know that when you talk about errors on FEMA's mapping, one of the issues we can find challenging is sometimes you find little errors within the actual data itself, or maybe some shading is missing. I know we had a comment in the chat about some SFHA shading being missing. You can also consider the impact and the challenge of communities that are not a full community revision. Like you stated, sometimes it's just going to be a few panels, one at minimum up to the entire community. When you deal with partial county revisions, along with changing potential community boundaries at the same time, and those kind of mesh together in odd ways. Sometimes you're looking at a little bit of older data, sometimes you've got some new data, and then you have to dive in a bit deeper there. There have even been communities that once the PMRs have been issued and made effective, they decide they weren't able to get through that. Maybe their appeals weren't heard. And we've had communities actually pull and say they no longer want to be part of the program because they don't agree with the way the maps, the data that the maps are now showing. I believe it was a Massachusetts county that did that within the last decade, I remember. But those were a few of my notes listening to you there. Barry, you have anything to add to the challenges? We got it pretty covered there.
No, yeah, I do agree that sometimes when we do have partial revisions or even, whole counties that are revised, we do run into quite a few issues where community boundaries don't match up. Sometimes you have some bleed over into another community, or you have some data missing in between the two communities when you get that digital data and you try to import it into your system. So yeah, there's definitely some challenges with the FEMA data that we receive on a weekly basis. And of course, one of the big ones, as Corey was stating, is the revalidations. Sometimes we don't receive those until, we did receive, most of those communities that went into effect today, we received those revalidation letters on Monday. But it would have been nice to receive those a couple months back. That way we could have started, looking into processing those ahead of time. And then, of course, we still haven't received Broward County. And I know that's something the NFA is working on with FEMA to try to, get that revalidation letter, because there are a lot of properties that are, being affected by the holdup with that revalidation letter.
Right. And all of this that you brought up, particularly, again, the mapping and data issues, that is what the Data and Mapping Committee of the National Flood Insurance is all about. That's what we do. We work with FEMA. We provide a collective voice for all of our members with FEMA to try and get those issues resolved as quickly as possible, rather than have each stakeholder attempting to address this, often trying to attempt to address the same issue with FEMA over and over. We bring everyone together. We collect these issues. We take them straight to FEMA to get them resolved.
All right. So it looks like we've got some questions. Let's see here. So we have a question: given that FEMA has a 6-month lead time for releasing their firm changes, how and when will FEMA communicate these changes to all stakeholders, lenders, property owners, vendors, etc.? So I'll answer a little bit here. I know that there are processes for appeals. The community definitely has to be made aware. So through that floodplain administrator who is working with FEMA specifically, they're going to be given ample opportunity to make it public. So depending on the size of the community, Broward has it all over their website, all the way down to these little small communities that may still have community newspapers, and then it's going to be published in their little community newspaper, those types of things. So it starts there. It starts with the stakeholders within the community having the ability to appeal and give feedback to FEMA before the preliminary data is made effective. I think is it 90 days when it goes into that appeal period? I apologize for.
Yeah.
I think it's 90 days there.
Right. So they do a physical physical study. Once the study is done, and again, the process for changing a map is years. Doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
So the study is done, that data is compiled, a map is created, and then that is shared with the communities. There is a public comment period. Like you said, there's a 90-day window where any stakeholder involved in that map, so anybody from a property owner to the head of the county, can bring a challenge or question the data, bring new data for consideration. And then once that 90 days closes, they reevaluate and determine, does the map need to change from what we've done already or not? Do we move forward with what we have? And then once the map is again finalized, if they make changes, I think they go through another 90-day comment period. But once the map is finalized, that's when you get the letter of final determination, the notice in the Federal Register, and the 6 months lead up to the actual map going into effect.
Mm-hmm. Looks like in the chat, Natalie Hitchcock has a question that kind of ties onto this one. Does FEMA ever reconsider a revision they're making if the communities believe the data is incorrect? Is there a process of contestability? So that falls into the appeals period, essentially, when the community gets to come out and review the maps before they're made effective, actually before they're even made preliminary, maybe. And then to follow up on what Corey said, yes, there are some communities, their maps are put into preliminary status and then they just hang there for quite a bit of time for a number of reasons.
Right. And there are requirements for the community. I believe the requirements are on the community to make these maps public. Mm-hmm. There are public meetings held where the community and FEMA representatives will present the maps to local residents. There are postings published in newspapers. Probably nowadays, it's more likely there's postings on community websites and social media. Mm-hmm. I can't remember the last time I actually looked at a newspaper. So, but yeah, so there are actual requirements in the statutes that this sort of thing has to be made public, has to be presented to the public in a timely manner, give them enough time to review and comment.
So I see another question in the chat from Howard Levine about 147. Some LOMARs cover a large area and do not include an annotated map. The LOMARs are described with a multi-page long legal description that is almost impossible to map. Is it possible for FEMA to issue an annotated map for the multi-page legal description area that is impacted? So we actually had our data and mapping meeting yesterday, and this was one of the topics that we discussed. So the letter of map revision that you're talking about will most likely be a letter of map revision based on fill, as opposed to the letter of map revision with an annotated firm. And the data submitted to FEMA that includes the long pages of the meets and bounds descriptions, those are going to be whoever is submitting that LOMA, whatever professional has drawn that meets and bounds. We have definitely asked for the maps to be provided because we know that those multi-page meets and bounds sometimes make no sense depending on how they're transcribed or transposed, and the maps would be very helpful because the intent is not always seen through the drawing of the meets and bounds, and then we end up ordering the applications sometimes from the engineering library to actually confirm what the intent was of the document. So that is a pain point for us that we are working on as well, trying to get FEMA to potentially even, I guess, consider including the map when we have those types of LOMARs. Anything to
Yeah,
add
that
to
is that's been a question brought up quite frequently, unfortunately, and it is a drawback of the LOMAR process that FEMA issues a letter essentially based on how it was applied for.
Right.
So if you ask for them to remove a structure, they issue a structural removal or non-removal. If you ask for a property, they issue a property. If you send them a meets and bounds description, they issue based on that meets and bounds description. Now, like we're talking about here, more like than not, the application they get includes additional information like a survey or map showing that area. But if the description of that area, which is all they put on the letter, is flawed, that's what they publish and that's what they issue. So that is something we would love very much to work with FEMA on.
Absolutely. Let's see, we get another question in here. Where was it? It was about whether, if we know ahead of time that a property is going to map in, would it behoove the homeowner to go and get insurance in place before the new maps become effective? I apologize. I was trying to see who that was. That question was Tim Murphy, right? Yes. For a property going into the floodplain, is it better for the property owner to obtain flood insurance before the mandatory requirement goes into effect? Or is it okay for them to wait until after the mandatory requirement goes into effect? Let's see, Barry or Corey, you guys have any thoughts about that?
Honestly, no. So once upon a time, it would have been advisable for them to obtain flood insurance prior to the change. However, several years ago, FEMA changed the way that they rate flood insurance. Mm-hmm. You may have heard of risk rating 2.0. Well, that's that change. What that change involved took zones out of the quoting process, took it out of the rating process completely. They also did away with what was called the preferred risk policy. What that was the low cost flood insurance policy for properties outside of a special flood hazard area. So back in the day, that's what you would have gotten, a PRP, the low cost policy prior to a map revision putting you in the flood zone. Now there are discounts still, but I would advise everybody to talk to their agent as soon as they know something is changing and find out what their best options are. Because the PRPs don't exist anymore, but there are still discounts available. So an agent would know best.
Yes.
And so as soon as you know something's changing, you want to talk to your agent.
You also want to consider the fact that just because you're not in what is considered a mandatory flood zone today, it doesn't mean you don't have risk. And if you know you're going to be mapped into a mandatory flood zone, then you would assume that today you have that risk, even though the map wouldn't show it effective for 6 months from now. So that would be something to consider as well.
Exactly. Just because we haven't hit that map effective date, those maps are being redrawn for a reason. So.
Got it. Well, I think that covers our topics today. Layla, did you have a...
I think, I mean, this is great discussion, and there's certainly a lot of questions. And so it would be really great for us to be able to go through those after the session. And maybe there's a way that we can compile some answers and get those disseminated to the group as well. I think that it seems like that would be really beneficial to everyone who's attending. And also, here's some contact information for us. So please, feel free, group, to reach out if you have any additional questions, anything comes to mind, once you leave this session. We'd be happy to hear from you. And so again, we definitely encourage that. And we really appreciate all of the input, the questions, and the interest. So thank you all. We are at the top of the hour, a little 1 minute after. So I wanted to just close really quickly with a couple of comments. One, I just want to remind you all that you will continue to have access to the information in this app. Pardon me. We will make the PowerPoint available in the documents section of the app. So just keep an eye out for that. We should have that there by the end of the day. And then we'll also follow up with an email and, LinkedIn post with information about accessibility of this recording on NFA's YouTube channel. Want to also extend a special thank you to the ASFPM for allowing certified floodplain managers the opportunity to earn CE credit for attending today. And if you're interested and have not already, please don't forget to enter the word Broward in the CE credits section of this app. We'll be following up with each of you to provide your certificate of attendance. And finally, and you've got that slide up there, before we sign off, please mark your calendars for NFA's 2025 annual conference, which will be April 6th through 8th in gorgeous Scottsdale, Arizona. Once again, registration will be open this fall. And in the meantime, you can navigate to our website or scan the QR code on the screen for highlights of our 2024 conference. We hope to see you all in Scottsdale next year. Until then, thank you for attending and take care.